Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 42, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Justin, I think I've just awoken from my android dream.
Ooh. Was it a dream or a nightmare, buddy?
I think it was a nightmare. That's the way things go.
If you have an android sheep on the roof of your apartment complex, and some people think that perhaps this might not be an android, it can deceive people into them thinking it's alive. Wouldn't they need grass to eat? How are they fed? Is there a big bundle of hay up there? You know, these are the questions that keep me up at night.
Well, Justin, it's a good thing we're doing a podcast where we can answer questions like that regarding this pretty exceptional book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And if you're new to the show for some reason, you're like, hey, I thought this was a mystery, hard-boiled noir type podcast. Well, we're doing a special episode today on Neo-Noir, science fiction noir, fantasy noir, speculative noir, whatever you want to call that sort of part of the genre. And to highlight that, we're going to be talking more specifically about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So my name is Kurt, and joining me is Justin. Are you ready for this topic, Justin?
I more or less am. I watched both Blade Runner films last night, or in the last two nights, and this book, which surprisingly differs as much from the Ridley Scott films as it has in common with them. So pretty exciting read. And hey, welcome back to the United States, Kurt.
Oh yeah, here we are. We've had a chance to unpack our bags just in time for the dystopic future.
Yes, we flash forwarded. We went around the world on our noir trip for the past year almost, and we got back, but somehow we hit a wormhole and traveled all the way into the distant future, 2019. Whoops.
Yes, yeah, there's a little bit of an oversight there. So, well, at least we haven't had World War III just yet, and we're not all wearing shielding cod pieces to protect us from the radiation. But we'll get to that here. This was a different take for us, and it was interesting. I was going to watch the films just like you did, but I said, you know what? I've seen those movies probably, well, at least the original Blade Runner, probably more than just about any other film than Star Wars or the Indiana Jones films. So I didn't need to see it again. I wanted to keep the book a little fresher in my mind, but they are different. However, I do think, unlike some book to movie transitions that we see, like it feels pretty true to the original source material. Even if the story isn't exactly right, I feel like it definitely grabs the emotion that's in the book. But we'll get to that. First, before we get into our deeper discussion, anything new and exciting with you, Justin?
I got tickets to a Napalm Death concert this morning, so that's exciting. They're coming to Albuquerque in May. Yeah, so that's a nice end of semester gift to myself.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so that's happening. I also bought a return flight from LA, where I'm going to be visiting my sister in a couple months. So putting down money, investing in the future. I like to do that once in a while, especially when I feel like all hope is gone now that I'm teaching again and have no time for myself.
Fair enough. Yeah, putting things on the schedule is good.
How about you?
Well, not too much. It's been I feel ready for the cyberpunky discussion of this book because I spent my morning driving around a very rainy Seattle. We've had the most rain in January ever.
Wow.
Or at least maybe not ever, but in recent recorded weather.
That's really saying something.
Yeah. We're quite above normal here. So yeah, that was not so fun, but it did maybe perhaps put me in the right frame of mind to discuss this book. One thing that I did see just recently is I guess it's under the crime fiction umbrella, I would certainly say, but I saw the film Parasite, the South Korean picture.
Oh, I can't wait.
It is very good. I would strongly recommend any listener to this show go check this out. Of course, it is in Korean, but Just give you the general premise is that you have a family that is really down and out, and they basically, they're living quite literally at the bottom of the city in a basement. They're struggling to eat. They do jobs like assemble pizza boxes to get a little bit of something to eat. And through a school connection, the younger boy of the family gets a job as an English teacher. And this job is with a pretty rich, well-to-do family, and he ingratiates himself with the family. He gets the job. And one of the kids might need an art tutor, and his sister is kind of an artist, so he fakes her credentials and she becomes a teacher as well. And slowly this entire family starts working for this rich family. And I'll leave it at that, because anything further, I think, would kind of ruin the film, but is just expertly shot. It's expertly paced. The writing is good. The acting is great. I just really enjoyed this movie, and it kind of, there's thriller elements to it. There's psychological elements to it. There's crime elements to it. And it's just all around a very well done film. Any awards that it's going, I know this thing's going to win awards, and it deserves them. That movie is Parasite.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch that. It's on my short list, very short list, in fact. I want to keep this next conversation brief, but I'm going to ask you this, and I'm going to give you 1 minute for us to have this conversation. Okay. What's your opinion of the rise of Skywalker and the end of the Star Wars Skywalker saga?
I'm ready to be done with the Skywalker saga. This last film in the 9 films was okay. I think it's an impossible film to make because you're never going to satisfy everybody.
No.
I think they gave some characters their due in a nice exit. I think they failed for other characters. The thing that I kept thinking while I was watching the film is I can't wait for The Mandalorian season 2.
Yes, The Mandalorian and Baby Yoda. That's it. We only 6 months away.
The thing here is that they've opened up the franchise. We're done with these movies. Let's see what other creators will do with the rest of Star Wars and other characters. That's what I want out of Star Wars.
I agree. I think when I was a kid, I loved the world building. It was all about world building, like some of the books we're going to be talking about today. And it got so lost in its own navel gazing with George Lucas and the prequels, and then trying to please all audiences in the last trilogy. And like you said, an impossible task. And I think that I wouldn't have wanted to be Abrams. I think he did all right with parts of it, and some of it was really good, but there were certain parts that just did not work for me. If I had to pick the noirist film of the 9, I would. It's going to be Empire Strikes Back for me, and that's also the best film. So maybe we should have a whole Star Wars noir trilogy, or maybe just a one-off in the future. That would be nice. Who would we have to direct that? Maybe Tybo.
What a weird film that would be.
Totally. Anything else before we dive into my relatively brief summary of Do Androids Dream?
No, yeah, let's get into it. If for folks who are familiar, I'm going to assume most people are familiar with at least one of the Blade Runner films, but yeah, give us a summary of the actual book that this is all based on.
Okay, so Point Blank fans, welcome back to the United States of America. We're now in the future, except wait, we're not. Dick originally had this novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which came out in 1968. He had it set in 1992, but that changed a long time ago, and publishers changed it to 2021. The film actually has it set in 2019. So I don't know what's going on, but we are either in the future or we're in the past, but we're really close to being in the present. There's that. Let's just say that we're in the U.S. and what happens in this book happened after some kind of nuclear Armageddon. The main character is Rick Deckard. You might picture Harrison Ford, but you are picturing the wrong guy. This Deckard is a different kind of guy and a different kind of cop, though there are some similarities. The story is set in, like I said, post-apocalyptic San Francisco, not LA, years after most human beings have fled for the red dust of Mars. Many of the people who remain on Earth, you might call them left behind, are not legally allowed to leave. The derogatory word for them is chickenheads. They are the stupid, the dysfunctional, the unproductive. They live on Earth like they always have in the pockets of space still livable, but they need an infrastructure. They need society to function, and they need to be policed. So Deckard and his ilk work for the San Francisco Police Department, but Deckard himself is a specialist, a bounty hunter. Not of chicken heads, of course, fortunately for them, but of androids. And that's the other thing about this society. Androids exist, many models of androids, and obviously, given the title, it's a major theme in this novel is what are androids and how do they function and how do they relate to humans. The early models of androids were clearly non-human, but these new models, it's more difficult to tell. These androids are made for Mars colonists as incentive to leave Earth. Essentially, they're slaves or treated as slaves. But some have, they're relatively sentient and they escape Mars. They are damn close to being human or maybe beyond. Who's to say? They return to Earth and live undercover in exile. Deckard's job, in essence, is to find them and delete them. To retire them is the euphemism. He hunts them down, and that's pretty much the major premise of the novel, that there's more to the novel than simply that. If you're expecting an atmospheric neo-noir novel along the lines of the Blade Runner film, you may be disappointed because it's not as noirish, it's not as atmospheric as the films. Thematically, though, this story is more sci-fi than noir, though the setting is bleak. I'll admit that. It doesn't have the hard rain and the overabundance of neon that the films do, but the themes are dark and the questions raised are pretty heavy in classic Dickian style. Okay, more about these androids. The big ones in this story are called the Nexus 6. They're the sixth in line, sort of like the iPhone 6. They're highly skilled, and killing them is a difficult task. But Deckard is eager to collect the bounty so he can afford a live goat to replace his android sheep, which has been killed, I think, or deactivated, essentially. Deckard's wife's name is Iran, and she uses a mood organ to accentuate her state of perpetual depression. Deckard hopes a real animal might make her happy, might make him happy, might make his life more meaningful, might help them to feel like they're competing in terms of status with the neighbors. These questions raised are very different from the ones raised in the book. In this case, in the movie. In this case, Deckard is married and has this life and sort of wants to maybe keep up with the Joneses or maybe give the pretense of keeping up. It's a weird twist that I wasn't quite expecting. So essentially, the question remains: will he complete his task and retire the newly liberated androids so that he can afford his new goat or whatever else he decides to buy? You find out. Start off, Deckard kills one of the androids, and then he tries to kill another who happens to be a well-liked opera singer, but she calls the cops on him. Deckard gets brought in to the police department, but given he's a cop, he knows he's in the wrong place. It's actually a fake police department run by androids. Here, there's another bounty hunter named Phil Rash who thinks he himself is retiring androids, but it turns out he is actually working for androids and retiring fellow bounty hunters. It's a pretty trippy what is reality style scene that I really enjoyed, threw me for a loop for a moment until I realized what was going on. Ultimately, this is a story about ideas. Dick raises big questions like he does in all of his books. In this one, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be human? What makes one human? And how is humanity maintained? And Dick also does us the favor of not answering these questions. Another character of import that sort of plays a major subplot is a guy named Isidore. He's a chickenhead who lives on the edge of town in a big apartment complex. And when he's not at his job, he watches the never-ending talk show hosted by Buster Friendly. Isidore befriends a Nexus 6 android named Briss. She moves in and brings her pals Ray and Irmgard, all of whom are being sought by Deckard for retirement. So it sets up the final scene, or final showdown, I guess. We also learn a lot about a religion called Mercerism. It's one built on empathy and features a savior hybrid of Jesus Christ and Sisyphus, who is accessible, this guy Mercer, through a device called an empathy box, which is like a virtual reality box where you go in and feel less alienated from your miserable life. Who can practice Mercerism? Not androids, not chicken heads, who then gets to experience this symbolic act of empathizing? This is another question that Dick raises and doesn't quite answer. Deckard struggles over whether his work as a bounty hunter is right, whether or not he is the man he thinks he is, and later, after he takes care of business and heads into the nuclear desert to find meaning, he momentarily becomes Mercer, or does he? He also finds a toad. Don't worry, it all makes sense, I think. If you are expecting Blade Runner or want only the film, like I said, this might not quite work for you, but if you open your mind up and think about Dick and his body of work and what he has to offer, you should find great value in this book. I certainly did. And it does have aspects of the film. I mean, it isn't that far off. It's just that the film streamlines and focuses on some of them while leaving some things like Mercerism out. While the film is a feast for the eyes, as I see it, this novel is a feast for the mind. Though you might call parts of it noir, this is sci-fi philosophy as the kind that only Philip K. Dick can create at its finest. I give it 4.75 hits. Kurt, what's your assessment? Did I miss anything?
I think you've hit it pretty well there, Justin. I think you've given this book a lot of justice, and you remind me just how much is packed into this relatively short book. I mean, one of the interesting things, and I'll come back to this later, is, I spent a lot of my life as a reader immersed in sci-fi and fantasy writing, and most of it is ridiculously long. This comes in much similar to a lot of our classic crime writing at like 220 pages. And boy, he gets a lot of concepts, a lot of characters, a lot of themes into a very small package. And I think that's why it works so well as a film. I didn't come to this expecting to see the film or read the film on the page, but I can certainly see how they got the films that they did out of this work. It makes sense to me. There were some unexpected twists. This was, like I said, this is the first time I actually read the book. The Mercerism angle was unexpected. Also, like you mentioned, Decker's obsession with getting this real goat that was a little odd, and we'll get into that in the main body of the topic. But I can see why the movie producer's like, yeah, let's just leave that aside. It's really this relationship between the androids and Decker that is the core of the book and really where it has the most to say. I really enjoyed the book. I think I'm going to give it a 4.5 just because my only hesitation here is that maybe at times some of the philosophical or almost religious elements of the book get a little bit further away from the plot than perhaps I would like, but still, I mean, this is a classic piece. You can look at it as a classic piece of science fiction. You can look at it as a classic piece of neo-noir. You can look at it as just a classic of 20th century American writing, for that matter. We'll get into Dick's body of work a little bit later on, but yeah, this is good. It's a well worth the read and an enjoyable book, especially since probably, like for many of you listeners, the story of Blade Runner is pretty strongly immersed in my and Justin's brains as being products of this part of the century. I mean, it's a definitive work.
I wish more sci-fi noir or sci-fi books were kept to 200 to 300 pages. I would read more of them.
It's something
for sure.
I think we'll get into here shortly in Subject Unknown. But first off, we have a featured review, and we haven't done a featured review for a little bit of time. And before I reveal what it is, I want to just give a shout out to our author here who requested that we do a review. And he wasn't sure if his work would be suitable for the show, but he heard whether we were doing this type of show. He's like, hey, take a look at my book. And you know what was really obvious in his email to us is that he listens to the show, and I really appreciate that. So if you're looking to submit something for us to take a look at and you happen to make it sound like you actually listen to the show, props to you. We're going to move that stuff to the top of the pile.
We like being loved.
and I love this book. So let me introduce today's featured review is Titan Shade. This is by Dan Stout. This is the first of the Carter archives. And I believe Justin has got a little bit of a summary for you. But first of all, I wanted to give a quote from its description here online. And this is from Michael Gear from the New York Times bestselling author. He says, take a little Mickey Spillane, some Dashiell Hammett, a bit of Raymond Chandler, and mix it with Philip K. Dick's Blade Runner. Add a taste of C.J. Box and Craig Johnson, and you've got a masterpiece of a first novel. So that's what he had to say about Titan Shade. So Justin, what is Titan Shade all about?
Real quick about future reviews, we don't guarantee that we're going to review. If somebody sends us something that's been published, we look it over, and if we like it, we may put it in 5-round bursts. And if we really like it, we'll put it in a featured review like we're doing here. So just a heads up. This novel, which is Stout's first, was put out by Daw in 2018, I think, and the second or the sequel to it is actually coming out this spring, 2020. So that's great. If you're into this first one, you know that there's more good stuff to come. And I think that this is a really good first book and worthy of a series. So let me tell you a bit about it. Here we are in a gritty fantasy otherworld where 70s era touchdowns like 8-Tracks and disco are still alive in the titular city of Titanshade, which is a northern oil boomtown surrounded by well-pocked tundra. Here we meet Carter, a down-on-his-luck cop with a troubled past that demands he keep out of the limelight for the good of the Titanshade brass. Along with his new partner, a Mullen campy named Ajax, he is tasked with investigating the murder of a squib in town to negotiate a new wind farm. So you might get the sense that there are multiple species at play here, and that would be correct. There are humans, the Mullen campy, which have a strange, almost predator-like mandibles, and we have squib, which are frog-like creatures, and they're not the only ones, but all of these folks operate in relative, I wouldn't call it harmony, but tolerance in this society of Titanshade. The big question is, who killed the southern frog man, the squib known as Hollandaise? What the hell was his name? Haberdash, something like that. Haberdine, that's his name. Who killed the ambassador Haberdine and why? These are the questions that drive the plot in the story. We learn that squibs have cinnamon-scented blood that send humans into fits of ultra-violent madness. We learn that special cops use magical divination to make the dead speak. We meet a variety of human and non-human species, including Carter's informant named Simon, his activisty do-gooder friend named Telena, and his old partner, who's now his nemesis and the bad guy, at least for part of the story, the crooked Flanagan. But let's not forget, there are other characters, including Ambassador Paulus and her moving live tattoos, and her assistant Jellica, who seems like a pretty cool person, and Carter takes a liking to her. The ambassador and her assistant are human, but there's something funny about them. Or is it just in our heads? What about Harlan, the boss hog of one of the old oil families? Is he the big bad, like he seems, or is there something else going on there? You'll find out. Surely one of these folks knows something about the murdered squib, and it's Carter's job to find out who it is and what they know, so long as his big mouth and bad temper stay out of the way. He's the classic archetype of the detective, the lone wolf, got problems, drinks too much. Bit of a trope, but given the new context, this world building that Stout does, it really works. I really, really love the world building in this story. I'm reminded of Blade Runner, of course, but also Jonathan Letham's Gun with Occasional Music, which is another book I love. We have a variety of humanoid species, like I say, and they fill classic noir detective character tropes. We have the femme fatale, we have the big bad, we have the crooked cops, we have all those characters, but it feels fresh when you mix it up and pull them out of the typical terrain that they occupy. City corruption reverberates through the story, not unlike a movie like Chinatown and its water schemes, or a slew of other novels of this ilk. Carter is a mostly likable guy. he's not a total dick, but I wouldn't call him a hero. I don't feel as if I quite get why he is so messed up. Like there are allusions to it, and we do get some backstory on that. But it is a long book, over 400 pages, and I feel like I that might have gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit for me. That said, I enjoyed him and his hunches. He wanders through the city from the subtropical Mount District with its steam vents that are used for warming to the outer fringes of the city where the ground is perpetually frozen in permafrost and the poor hunker in hovels high on whatever they can get. There's a lot of class stuff in this story, and the town of Titan Shade itself, the geography of it, is really interesting. The end is climatic, taking a turn into what feels almost like a horror flick as squib blood gets used for nefarious purposes and the oil fields on the periphery of the city become the scene of a major showdown. Did I like Titan Shade? Yes, definitely. It's a fun book that blends sci-fi and noir, humor and serious earthly themes into a well-crafted package. And the sequel, like I said, is coming out in spring 2020, so you'll have more Carter and Ajax to look forward to. I give it a 4.25 stars. Now, what do you think of this book, Kurt? What really stands out to you?
Well, I really did enjoy this book. I think it was an excellent debut novel. I'll just say that for me, this is a solid 4 out of 5. Highly recommended. Now the series, I'm excited about the series. I think the series actually propels that rating up a little bit because I want to see what he's going to do with this. And why do I love this? Because I love the world building. This is a great balance between the kind of world building, and we don't use this term in crime fiction that much, but the kind of world building indirectly you're doing in crime fiction and the world building that you're doing in sci-fi and fantasy. It's just the right amount of detail that he gives us throughout the book that builds up this world so that we get little glimpses of what he's done here. Now it's just similar enough. There's enough similarities in how things are structured, what people are doing, the technology available, that it's relatable for us here, as Earthers, I guess we could say. But sure. There's the differences are not just info dumped. And that's a problem with a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. There's too much info dumping of, oh, look at this. Isn't this wonderful, this world I created? Now, Stout manages his world building excellently. He gives us a little bit and we go back into the plot. He gives us a little bit more and we get back into the plot. It works nicely together. And that's what I really enjoyed. I like that Stout is obviously aware of he's aware of the noir and crime fiction roots. You'll see little nuances of that pop up in the fiction. There's certainly nods to those genre greats. I saw a bit of Hammett and Chandler in there. Maybe not as much in the writing style, but in the elements of his plotting and stuff like that. That is like, all right, this guy knows the genre. But what I really liked about this is that he wasn't afraid to take a mystery and put in something here that we can, the political tension. We're talking about a shift in this world. And let me just explain this for a minute, is that at one time this world, they used magic, but magic required a resource. That resource was essentially like ambergris, like the stuff, you get from whales, and
it's called mana, right?
Yeah, it's called mana, but it's essentially to our world, it would be like ambergris or whale blubber or something like that. And they've fished out all the whales in the world. So there's no more magic. Right. So they've gone through one loss of a resource. Then they tapped into oil and now the oil is disappearing. And that's what the tension of the book is about, is this resource depletion. Are they going to put in these wind farms? Are they going to shift to the alternative energy? Some people say yes. Some people say no. So, and that's a debate that we're in right now. So we can relate to this political tension right off the bat with what's going on in the story. So I think Stout handles that very well. I really did enjoy Titan Shade. It's a strong recommend for me. And again, the biggest thing I love here is the world building. And we're going to talk a little bit more about world building and Subject Unknown in a more general sense. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. And the second book in the series is called Titan's Day. That's going to be out pretty soon. And I see that the Kindle version, at least of Titan Shade, is right now anyway at a very affordable $1.99. So if you wanted to check this one out, you wouldn't have much of an investment. But I think you're going to enjoy it if the idea of a fantasy noir story appeals to you. But I love the setting. I love the story. I thought the characters were really well done. There were some, if I want to give it a negative thing, I thought that maybe about 3/4 of the way through the book has this little bit of struggle of, and this is a problem when you take two major genres, so, in this case, our sci-fi fantasy and our mystery fiction or hard-boiled fiction, and you blend them together. The book has a little bit of a struggle of which way am I going with this? Am I gonna finish this out with a strong mystery or more sci-fi elements? And I'll leave the reader to discover which way that works. But I think it starts very strong. I think it ends strong. There's just a little bit there in the middle. I'd like to see that.
The inertia of the first half of the book propelled me toward the end.
Yes.
But I admit I read the final parts faster. And like most genre fiction, there are things that happen to make the plot work that sometimes I get bored with that kind of thing. But I think to sum up and to agree with you, what Stout accomplishes here is balance, and he achieves balance on two fronts. One is knowing how much to share and how much to withhold, that editor's awareness of his own work. And, it's so easy for fantasy writers to geek out on their own world building. The question is how much of this geeking out is good for the reader, improves the reader experience, and how much of it is just your own, obsession. And one's own obsession does not always make a good read. So he seems to have struck that gold mine or that oil boom or that mana deposit with the way that he found balance there, and also balancing between the noir elements and the sci-fi elements without veering too heavily into one or the other, except for maybe at the end where some things might have gotten a little bit too tilted. Overall, good book, a fun book, a fairly fast read for being over 400 pages, and we recommend it here at Point Blank.
Yeah, I sure do. That's a strong recommendation. I'm going to pre-order book 2.
Subject unknown.
Subject unknown. Okay, so we are back in Subject Unknown, and probably without any surprise, we're going to talk about this idea of neo-noir. And I think for our purposes, Justin, it bugs me when we talk about noir sometimes, how people get really sticklers for various years of film production, and that's when noir exists, or this is when neo-noir exists. I think for our purposes, let's say that neo-noir is essentially the expansion of the ideas of noir fiction into other categories or new ways of telling noir stories. Because as we've discussed, noir in its basest form is a very, very old style of telling a story. But today what we're going to look at is this idea of neo-noir, noir in fantasy, in science fiction, maybe in post-apocalyptic fiction, possibly in Cthulhu type, mythos investigations. Let's look at noir in those contexts.
I do think that neo-noir fits this definition, but some people might think of neo-noir just as a revival of film noir or noir fiction from its first stages or its early days. And that is true also. It could just be noir that has come out in a modern time that doesn't deviate from the traditional form. So it's both. But the neo-noir that we're interested in is more, obviously with today being a talk about sci-fi noir and Dick, is the ways that we incorporate noir themes into cross-genre formats, right?
Sure. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I take a very strong stand against that narrow definition of neo-noir. I don't like that.
Gotcha.
I don't like the notion that some people seem to say, well, when Blade Runner came out is the date that neo-noir starts. I think that's ridiculous. We essentially have noir. Perhaps we could call this alternative noir or something along those lines, but I don't like defining noir into any kind of time scale. I don't agree with that. Can you think of any other subgenres here, Justin, where this label might apply?
No, I don't.
Well, that's fine. I mean, we'll start the conversation with those subgenres, and we'll see where this goes. But I think it's worth revisiting for our purposes, just taking a little bit of a look at our old definitions of mystery versus noir versus detective fiction. And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, but I think we just need to remind ourselves that those are not necessarily the same things. Can mystery fiction be detective fiction and noir fiction? Yes. Is noir fiction necessarily mystery or detective fiction? No. I think we need to look at that. I think all of these subgenres, and when we're talking broad-based speculative fiction here, we can find an example of mystery or detective fiction in almost any of those categories. That's certainly been done. Throw in an investigator and let's have a mystery. I think it's a little bit more rare to see noir fiction, certainly in fantasy writing, perhaps a little more common in science fiction and post-apocalyptic type fiction. But I do think it's still a rarity even within that timeline, because most of the speculative fiction tends to have a more positive focus to it. It tends to be very hero focused. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure if I would agree, because I haven't frankly read that much speculative. This isn't really my arena. I have a question though, that would speculative be more positive because it has more optimism, or simply that it has more of a hero trope, whereas noir and neo-noir is more commonly featuring an anti-hero?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a blend there. I think it does, at least traditionally, it is more hero focused. It's about the hero's journey.
Sure.
And I think, you can think of so many classic examples, whether that be the Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or something like that, that's what those stories are. It's the hero's journey to defeat evil. And now that's not to say that that's all of fantasy writing or all of science fiction writing, but that's probably, I don't know, in my experience, is probably 80 to 90% of it, which isn't to say that that's necessarily good. It's just the majority. I think before we get into that, let's also remind ourselves. I pulled out I believe it's 11 points here of noir fiction, and I'm just gonna really briefly remind ourselves of what those points are. You tend to have an outsider. Now, that part I think is relatively common in sci-fi and fantasy. A stranger comes to town, that sort of thing. Having an outsider. 2. No heroes in noir fiction. That is the opposite of a lot of sci-fi and fantasy writing. It's about heroes.
Sure.
Fatalism. That's another element of noir. As you asked, I think you're right to say that most fantasy and science fiction has a more positive angle to it. Not so much in post-apocalyptic. And I think you're seeing a change in the fantasy and science fiction that's coming out, but maybe we'll see that. I'm gonna skip a couple here because they're a little bit more pertinent to maybe film noir. There's a mystery. That can certainly be in fantasy and science fiction noir.
Sure.
Taking place in an urban environment. Now, science fiction, certainly has that happen a lot because that's what we're talking about. Fantasy, not as much. I love a good fantasy novel that takes place in a rich fantasy city, but I feel like that's usually pretty rare to find that. And it's even rarer to find that written very well. Most fantasy is going to be about going, and I'm using this sort of as an example here, but going to find the dragon in the cave and slaying the dragon. It's going into the wilderness, whatever that wilderness happens to be, to defeat the adversary. Another element of noir fiction, broken noses. So basically we're going to get in, we're going to have fights in noir fiction. That's going to be common in sci-fi and fantasy. And here's the big one for sci-fi and fantasy fiction, is that noir tends to not have a happy ending. And that's not in my experience, that's not what most people are looking for in fantasy and science fiction. It can be a very rough journey, but the ultimate things are going to conclude with a satisfaction at the end, and usually our protagonist is going to come out on top. The last one, and this is the one that we're not going to see in Philip K. Dick's book today, but you usually see in science fiction and fantasy, and that's pared back prose. Science fiction and fantasy is the world of overly flamboyant, flowery language. It's sometimes
it's the worst.
I used to love it. I used to love 3 pages of description on the origins of a sword. I don't want that anymore. And that's not to say that that's every writer. And it's very interesting that I think when we get into androids, I'm going to maybe mention a little bit about this, but the classic origins of fantasy and sci-fi share more in common with classic crime fiction than they do, I think, in a lot of ways with modern fantasy and sci-fi. And that's because of the connection to the pulp fiction of the time. But, oh my gosh, yes, pages and pages of description. And I think that's why we see, when we get a, neo-noir, speculative noir, whatever the hell we want to call this, modern alternative using mystery or noir elements in fantasy and science fiction, these books still stretch on longer than perhaps they should, as almost both the author and, well, the reader are expecting this. They want all those pages. They want all that description, and nobody's quite willing to say, hey, let's pare it back some.
I have a question. I would like to list or talk briefly about what people consider the best examples of like sci-fi or hard-boiled or future noir. These are other ways of describing this sort of fusion. Obviously, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is one of the progenitors of the genre, at least in the minds of certain people, particularly given the films.
Sure.
But there are other well-known examples, and in cyberpunk is included in this. Like Neuromancer, obviously, is like a classic book. Frankly, I'll admit I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure you have probably more than once. Are there other well-known examples of this fusion working really effectively?
Sure.
Do you know any off the top of your head?
Yes, I have a list here. And I think, what's interesting here is I think this is a list of things that people are going to tend to recognize. But the first one that comes to mind on TV right now, the first book in the Expanse books, that is an investigation. And now, those authors, it's 2 authors who write those books under a pen name, but they kind of shift subgenre from book to book. But that first book is very much a noir investigation in my mind. I mean, I won't give away what happens if you haven't read that, but it's an investigation and things don't necessarily go right.
I bought the book, and I did see the first season of The Expanse, and that was one of my immediate examples of this genre fusion, given the prominence of the detective in the show. And frankly, I don't feel like that. I don't think they quite landed that in the show.
No.
So I'll be curious to know how they landed that in the book. But I think it was a fair attempt at a mashup.
Yeah, I think it does land a little bit better in the book, but that's one. Also a TV show on Netflix, Altered Carbon. Those books are considered neo-noir.
I have that one listed as number 1 on one of the lists I came across for Sci-Fi Noir. So it was a fan vote thing, but it got a lot of votes compared to its second place, Do Androids Dream. So that's definitely on my radar.
Yeah. So, and then like 2, maybe more urban fantasy type series. You have the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, the Sandman Slim novels by Richard Kedry. I believe I reviewed the first book in the series a long time ago, maybe episode 2 or 3. But I'm going to give one that we're very familiar with from our childhood here, Justin. How about the book by Gary Wolfe, Who Censored Roger Rabbit? The book that Who Framed Roger Rabbit is based on.
That's crazy.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
I have not read the book.
I think that a lot of these... I think one thing that's interesting is even though there's not maybe as many books under this neo-noir label as we would hope, but a lot of them translate to film very well. So a lot of them have made that transition because it works, that the investigation type thing in a sci-fi setting works very well. It's a little harder to find true fantasy noir books that are well known, because as far as if you want to throw the well known label on it, I really can't think of one. There are examples out there. Let me just throw out. Okay, so this was a best-selling book, The Yiddish Policeman's Union.
Oh, I read that. I really enjoyed that book.
Okay, I didn't read that one, but that comes up a lot.
For those who haven't read it, it's a speculative fiction that imagines a scenario where, in the wake of World War II, instead of the Jewish diaspora being moved to Israel, they get moved to Alaska. A Jewish state is set up in the panhandle of Alaska, and there's a murder mystery involved in this space, and there's a detective who's trying to solve this crime. It's a great example of world building where things are Earth and things are a society that we're familiar with, and yet because of this shift in the past, everything's just a little bit different. And Michael Chabon, who does a real good job of finding that balance, just like Dan Stout does in Titan Shade. And a little connection with Michael Chabon is that he's the main screenwriter for the new Star Trek Picard series. The Dresden Files, I thought that series was a little more fantasy. I hear very good things about it when I searched for this genre. What was your opinion of that one?
Well, you're right. The Dresden Files is a little more fantasy. It's urban fantasy, which I kind of consider its own thing. There's probably a lot more crossover with urban fantasy type stories to, mystery, certainly fiction. Well, usually when I say fantasy, I'm thinking high fantasy, Lord of the Rings kind of stuff, magic.
Gotcha.
Not pseudo medieval world, whatever. Sure. The Dresden Files, I did try reading some of that. I think I made it to 2 or 3 books. It just doesn't do it for me. I'm not real big into the whole urban fantasy, vampires and werewolves crap as some people. Yeah, so those are some of the big ones. Another one which I'm actually going to review two that I'm going to review in 5-round burst is The City and the City by China Mayville and the Automatic Detective by A. Lee Martinez.
Yeah, China Mayville's a big one.
Yeah. I just love his writing. He's one of my top authors all the time. So, but yeah, and I guess it is worth noting that one of the first ones that kind of fits this label is a book called Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov. It's been around a while, and yeah, there are some examples that people are going to know. I think this is something you're certainly going to, you're going to know it when you see it. But yeah, that's some examples of neo-noir. The last thing I just wanted to mention, and I think again that Stout did this very well in his book Titan Shade, is the world building. World building is something we don't really get to talk about very much because these detective and crime books they're set in our world. We don't have to worry about these things. But when you start getting into a fantasy or science fiction world, you have an entire constructed world to experience as a reader. And that can be a very difficult thing to do as a writer because you're not just doing your plot. You're doing the history, the geography, the ecology, the technology, the cultures, the mannerisms of the people that you're writing about. And that can, with an unskilled hand, that can feel very false. And I think and I've read so many bad examples of this. I think that is one of the things I really liked about Stout's book, going back to that, is that his world building, it feels like a believable world. And that is the brilliance of good science fiction and fantasy writing, is that as the reader, you don't necessarily notice that. It should flow and it should make sense, and the reader shouldn't be put off by like, what? How does this work now? Because it should just all blend very nicely together. To me, that's a sign of good world building. And
Oh, I agree with that, and I mean I think that as much as you need, but no more than that, is a good lesson for all the things that need to go into a good genre book. Like thinking sci-fi noir, for example, you're going to have a certain level of real science or the idea of realistic science. But if you spend 5 pages talking about how the automatic door works, you're going to lose some
Yes,
readers. So you got to know you not got to know how to place it, well placed detail to help to create the visual, the image in the mind of the reader without beating them on the head of your scientific
certainly.
prowess.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a real challenge. So I don't know if we've really, gone covered a lot of ground here with this discussion of speculative noir, but
I think there's so many subgenres within this greater arching neo-noir, speculative noir. Like there's sci-fi detective noir, there's hard-boiled noir, there's high fantasy noir, there's urban fantasy hard-boiled noir. Like there's so many different directions we can go that the best we can do is generalize.
all right. So last up for this episode is a brief biography of Philip K. Dick. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about Philip K. Dick. He is an absolute legend in this field of science fiction and, well, mostly science fiction. But I'm going to keep it pretty brief today. First of all, he was born December 16th, 1928. He died March 2nd, 1982 of a heart attack after a stroke. Somewhat interestingly, and some people speculate this is why he deals with identity and so much in his life. He was actually born a twin. He had a twin sister who died 6 weeks after birth. So some people suggest he was haunted by that in his life. I don't know if there's a lot of substance to that, but anyway. During the course of his writing career, he published 44 novels, more than 120 short stories. His work has been made into 13 films and been the foundation for 3 TV shows. Basically, if there's an award for science fiction that was around at the time, he won it. He won 3 Hugo Awards, 5 Nebula Awards, 1 John W. Campbell Award, and many, many assorted prizes. He's a distinguished author enough that there is, in fact, the Philip K. Dick Award that is a rather prestigious award in this time. So he was born in Chicago. At an early age, they moved to San Francisco. His parents would divorce at an early age. This led him sort of going around the country a little bit. He had a little bit of trouble in school. Interestingly, it was noted that he got a C in writing composition. Obviously, he got better at that. He attended Quaker schools, and by the time of high school, he found himself back in California and attended Berkeley High School. Interestingly, he was in the same high school class as Ursula K. Le Guin, another, well, in my mind, one of the best fantasy sci-fi authors of the 20th century. And
Yes.
interestingly, though, the two of them didn't know each other in high school, apparently.
That's so weird.
Yeah. He briefly attended UC Berkeley, but would sort of move on from that. He had some trouble with college. Now, he starts publishing short stories in 1951 at the age of 22, and he struggles with success in his writing until 1962, when he wins a Hugo Award for the alternative history book, The Man in the High Castle. Now, that was probably familiar to a lot of people because it's been made into a TV show by Amazon, which is currently running right now.
That's the first Dick book I read.
Yeah. I've never read that. Was it good?
I thought so. I mean, the premise is great.
Yeah.
Again, alternative history. So
Sure. He writes, well, and this is just his notable books here, but he writes To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep in 1968. He writes Ubik in 1969 and Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said in 1974. His writing makes a major shift in 1974, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Through the 50s and 60s, he's very prolific. He's influential to a lot of writers that you're, just kind of a who's who list of sci-fi, specifically sci-fi, but sci-fi and fantasy writers of the 70s and 80s. People like K.M. Jeter, James Baylock, and Tim Powers, which are all very good if you've never read any of them before. In 1971, and this is perhaps brought about the high pressure of, he really turned out a lot of writing in the 50s, specifically in the 60s. But in 1971, one of his 5 marriages, but this marriage to Nancy Hackett breaks up, and his life goes on the rails. He's been abusing amphetamines for at least a decade. Once his life moves out, he can't write. He's got writer's block. He lets a bunch of druggies move into his house to help pay the rent. His house is broken into. A safe that he has is blown up. The police think he does it himself. It's just a mess. In 1972, he goes to a convention in Vancouver, and perhaps to escape all this chaos back at his house, he very quickly falls in love with a fellow conference goer or whatever, and decides he's going to stay in Canada. Well, that doesn't work out. And he decides briefly after that he's going to attempt to kill himself. That didn't work. And, he's saved from that experience, and kind of sort of gets things straightened out a little bit. But things get even kookier in around 1974, where he has this rather odd religious experience. And I'm going to read just a brief part of that here for you. So he's at his house, and he's under the influence of it looks like some pain medication, when a woman shows up at his door to basically, see if he wants to join Jesus or whatever. And he sees this fish-shaped design on her neck, and she explains that that's a symbol of the early Christians. And Dick recounted that as the sun glinted off the gold pendant, the reflection caused the generation of a pink beam of light that mesmerized him. He came to believe the beam imparted wisdom and clairvoyance, and also believed it to be intelligent. On one occasion, Dick was startled by a separate reoccurrence of the pink beam. It imparted the information to him that his infant son was ill. Blah, blah, blah.
Jesus Christ, man. This
guy
needs a nap.
Yeah, so from this point on, he's experiencing weird hallucinations. He gets very spiritual, and I'm going to just put that in quotes because this is all very odd spiritualism. There's geometric patterns involved. He goes paranoid, basically. He's writing letters to the FBI to accuse people of being communist spies.
Yes, he became a government informant, which surprised me. It goes against this whole notion of this counterculture anti-hero.
Well, and he just fell apart mentally, it seems. And I'm sure the huge amount of drug use here did not help anything.
No.
So probably the most notable work that he writes post 1974 is A Scanner Darkly, which was made into a film recently, and that was written in 1977. He dies relatively young in 1982. What is that? 50 some years old? 53 years old. One has to imagine that the prolific drug use, particularly amphetamines and things like that, contributed to his death. But especially that Philip K. Dick writing of the 50s and 60s was hugely influential in 20th century American writing, not just for the idea of science fiction and fantasy, but these concepts that he explores about what is life, identity, artificial intelligence, consciousness, human nature, just these universal themes, but he does them in ways that it makes sense that we have, probably all of us have seen at least one movie made from a Philip K. Dick work. That's Philip K. Dick, certainly a very influential writer. We could spend much more time with him and his writing, but I think that works for our purposes today.
Thank you for that. He is a fascinating human being, or was, and I'm pretty convinced that the speed killed him ultimately, but the speed also helped him to produce a massive body of work that I've only begun to crack. So I look forward to reading more of his non-noirish stuff in the future.
Well, that sounds good. Anything else for today's episode, Justin?
Let's talk about our future episodes beyond Philip K. Dick. Episodes 44 and 45, we go back in time a little bit to some good old classic American hard-boiled fiction with Richard Stark's The Hunter. This is a book that got made into a movie called Point Blank. And Richard Stark, for those who are unaware, is a pseudonym of Donald E. Westlake. So a good punch-em-up, anti-hero, hard-boiled yarn to look forward to. And after that, episodes 46 and 47, we're going to go on a little vacation to Hawaii, still within the United States, but Hawaiian noir, Tiki Noir is another name for this, Polynesian Noir. What's going on out there in the islands? We're going to do that for a little while before we come back and at episode 50, which is going to be a time when we consider revisioning what Point Blank looks like. So things to look forward to. How do they contact us?
Yeah, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook, Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at pointblanknoir. In the meantime, if you like the show, feel free to give us a rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. Until next time, we will see you in the future, the past, 2019. I don't know. How does this Blade Runner thing work?
Nobody knows. Dick kept all the secret.
There we go. All right. See you next time, folks.
Bye-bye.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.